You do not owe anybody your vote. She's got to come and earn your vote.
At the end of last year, former President Donald Trump, who is, of course, running again in 2024, was removed from the ballot for the Colorado GOP primary for his alleged involvement in the January 6th riots. I say allegedly because, as of now, he has yet to be convicted of anything relating to that day, which is why this decision was so strange to me. I'm no fan of the 45th president, and I'm certainly no attorney, but it seems dubious to me that the government would legally prevent someone from running in a particular state when they haven't even been convicted of a crime. Literally, as I'm writing this video, the GOP has appealed the decision, and the Colorado Secretary of State has put Trump back on the ballot. Time will tell where this all ends up. Trump wasn't the only presidential candidate to be removed from a state ballot last year. Back in December, the Florida Democratic Party removed all the candidates other than Joe Biden from the ballot. As we'll see, the circumstances of these two cases are considerably different. And, as I'll argue, the latter is actually defensible. As the Washington Post reports, under Florida rules, the state party votes on who will appear on primary ballots. Florida's Democratic Party said in a statement on Friday that the executive committee voted unanimously late last month to name Biden, and only Biden, to its list of candidates. It's technically not canceled, and I'm not sure what the rules are on write-ins, but it doesn't seem like anyone else has any chance of winning Florida at this point. All things considered, it is a strange move. It's typical for a political party that holds the White House to use its institutional power to back the incumbent, and challenges to incumbent presidents from their own party are few and far between. That said, party actions like this are usually not that heavy-handed, and it's even more strange that the party would be so brazen, given that Biden was very unlikely to lose the Florida primary to begin with, even if his challengers were on the ballot. Needless to say, Biden's long-shot opponents are not happy about this.
So let's be honest about what's happening in the state of Florida. Authoritarianism, anti-democratic values, and not what the Democratic Party should stand for.
And I have to say, after years of listening to the online left talk about rigging, they finally have an actual case of it happening. Actually, I'm not even sure it's fair to say that this primary is rigged, because the Democratic Party is hardly having a primary to begin with. Again, this is very typical for the party that controls the White House, and I know this will be very controversial, but I think it's a defensible thing to do. As I'll be talking about later in this video, I think that the democratization of the primary process for offices low and high in the United States has not been a good thing. As far as the online left's reaction goes, let's be clear here. They were always going to say it was rigged, even if it wasn't. No, I take that back. If they had won, they would have said it was democracy. Rigged is something they only say when they lose. You could have the most open, transparent, and fair process possible. Hell, you could even have a process that massively favors their candidates, and they'd still say it was rigged if they lost. And I know this because we now have 3 different election cycles, 2016, 2020, and 2024, where the DNC and the Democratic establishment behaved very differently. And the reaction from the online left has been the exact same every single time. In 2016, the Democratic Party used institutional power in subtle ways to advantage Hillary Clinton. As I've argued before on this channel, the measures taken have been greatly exaggerated by lots of people, and if you look at what they actually did, I don't think it had a meaningful impact on the outcome. For example, I've heard so many times that Hillary got all the debate questions beforehand. But if you look at the DNC leaked emails, there's only evidence that she got 2 questions ahead of time. One was about the death penalty, and the other on the Flint water crisis. Not exactly the biggest issues in 2016. Hillary has never been a good debater, and in my opinion, her answers to these questions were quite lackluster. Now, that's 2 questions too many if you want a fair process, and I get why Sanders supporters are upset about it. While I won't be making that case in this video, I think what was true of the debate questions is true of other things the DNC did or supposedly did in 2016. Most of the case of rigging is based on falsehoods or exaggerations. And if you look at what actually happened, it's hard to believe that any of it moved the needle in a significant way. The online left calling it rigged is an extreme exaggeration, but I guess there's truth to it in a very technical sense. Like I said earlier, in 2024, they're not really having one. So the online left has justifiably called that rigged. Yet, in 2020, the DNC did absolutely nothing to interfere with the process. Yet the reaction from the online left was indistinguishable from their reactions in 2016 and now.
Bernie Sanders nearly won in the primaries in both 2016 and 2020 as a consequence of a lot of work for decades to legitimize progressive perspectives politically.
And he lost as a direct result of the DNC being propped up and allowed to run roughshod over the will of the voters.
Instead of recognizing that maybe the Democratic primary voters didn't want Bernie Sanders as their nominee, or recognizing that maybe Bernie Sanders didn't successfully persuade people to vote for him, the online left pointed their fingers at the institutions they love to rail against and screeched rigged. All voters are just temporarily confused progressives that rightfully belong to Bernie Sanders. They just don't know it. If you watch his channel, you know that the little excuse the online left came up with this time was that Barack Obama called all of the moderate candidates in the field and told them to drop out, while also instructing Elizabeth Warren to stay in, so that Joe Biden had an enormous advantage on Super Tuesday. I've debunked the myth of Bloody Monday several times on this channel, so I won't be bothering with that here. If you don't want to take my word for it that this whole thing is just the fever dream of butthurt Bernie supporters, just take a little time and actually read the reporting on the 2020 primary. That's literally all you have to do. And, of course, even if you take the theory at face value, it still fails. The online left always manages to leave out key details. Two of my favorites being, one, that Mike Bloomberg, the moderate mayor of New York City, was still in the race on Super Tuesday. The second being that, after Super Tuesday, when the field was just Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders in a straight-up contest, there were still about 2/3 of the delegates left to be won. Only 19 states had voted at this point, with 38 contests yet to happen. We hear a lot from the online left about how they're not obligated to vote for Democrats.
And let me tell you something else. Hillary Clinton you do not owe her your vote. The Democratic Party is not Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton is not the Democratic Party. You are the Democratic Party. You do not owe anybody your vote. She's got to come and earn your vote.
And they're right. You are not obligated to vote for anyone. Politicians should have to earn your vote. Why wasn't it Bernie Sanders' responsibility to get Democratic primary voters to cast their ballots for him after Super Tuesday, when the field was just down to him and Sleepy Joe? He failed to do that, which is why Joe Biden got over 9 million more votes. By the way, that is not rigging. That is called losing. Once again, according to the online left, all voters are just temporarily confused progressives. The thing is, the online left isn't unique in wishing away electoral results that don't go their way. That's something that's way too common in American politics these days. No, what really bothers me about the online left is that they make such a huge deal about democracy. They love democracy so much that they want to democratize so many different aspects of our culture and society, including our economy.
Socialism is about democracy. So if that's what people decide, then that's what they decide.
I don't know about this lady, but that is not the case with most of the online left. Despite constantly droning on about the importance of democracy, they do not appreciate it as a process, which is what democracy is. They have a results-based view of democracy. They think that democracy is them winning. And if they didn't win, then the process was somehow undemocratic. It's why online leftists can say things like this without a second of reflection.
I don't think Bernie's going to be running again because I do think that Joe Biden is going to be running again. And even if Joe Biden didn't run again, the Democratic Party is not selecting Bernie Sanders to be the nominee. And I think it's become abundantly clear to many of us that who they put their power behind is who ends up ultimately getting the nomination. It doesn't seem to be based on who's actually popular amongst the voters. They figure out a way to ensure that other voters come out and end up, changing the outcome.
I think that if the other guy got more votes, then he was probably the one who was actually more popular with the voters. But because the guy who got more votes wasn't a progressive, then somehow the electoral result must have been a contrivance by the establishment. One thing I will say for the online left is that they're right to call out the hypocrisy of the Democratic establishment.
We all know that we're living at a time when our democracy itself is in crisis. We all know that the threats to democracy of them that are represented by people such as Donald Trump. But the irony here, of course, is that the Democratic Party claims to be trying to protect democracy, but their way of doing it is to suppress democracy.
If you're going to screech about how democracy is truly under threat, and that our country won't have real elections again if we elect Donald Trump in 2024, then why are you abandoning democracy in your own nomination process? There is actually an argument to be made for that. I'll be talking about that later. But I don't think most of the Democratic Party institutionalists would subscribe to it. Again, I'm fine with the Democratic Party not having a real primary, but I don't share their rhetoric here. I am not a fan of Donald Trump, and I don't want him to become president again. But if he does get elected again, I think our country will somehow survive. And if we really are one election away from losing America to fascism or whatever, then our institutions were already in a perilously bad state. Furthermore, I think democracy is really overrated. Some form of democratic governance is good, or at least better than its alternatives, because it provides some level of accountability to those who govern. But past that, it's pretty much useless. And no, the alternative is not elitism, or technocracy, or oligarchy, or some other system of government. It's to not have the government have so much power and make so many decisions. The best alternative, in my opinion, is to give power back to individuals wherever possible. Markets are far better at problem solving than government is. But that's another video for another day. The thing is, over the last 50 years, the Democratic and Republican parties have democratized their processes for nominating candidates. And I don't think the results have been great. I wish the parties played a bigger role in determining who their candidates for office are. I wish there was more quote-unquote rigging going on. This isn't a radical idea. In fact, it's how we used to do things in this country. As Jonah Goldberg writes, we should declare the American experiment with primaries, presidential and congressional, a failure and find a better way. In the early 1970s, the United States became the first and only country where parties outsourced candidate selection entirely to voters, though France did start experimenting with primaries in recent years. Parties are essential to democracy, but that doesn't mean they need to be internally democratic. The military, the Department of Justice, newspapers, even the traditional family, all vital democratic institutions, don't outsource decisions to voters. The parties have become captured by their bases and the activist cadres, in and out of the media, who keep them whipped up in a constant state of anger, particularly at the other party. Parties are in the election business, in the same way Major League Baseball is in the baseball business. They have a vested interest in popular respect for, and faith in, the democratic process, grounded in the Constitution. If a baseball team owner declared that umpires were rigging the scoreboards, and that his team really won the World Series, despite the actual score, the MLB would recognize that as a threat to the integrity of the game itself, and act accordingly. He's not wrong about that. When Donald Trump went around in 2016 saying that the election was going to be rigged,
the election is rigged,
a lot of folks in the GOP were not happy with him. If it's rigged, then why will people even bother voting for any Republican, much less the presidential candidate? Of course, Donald Trump ended up winning in 2016, and magically the election wasn't rigged anymore. In 2020, after Trump lost yet maintained that he had won, most people in the GOP knew better but refused to speak up. Why? Because they're afraid of primary voters. The hyperbole around having a less democratic primary process is absurd. Just listen to presidential candidate Dean Phillips.
Just a handful of people decided to disenfranchise millions of Democratic voters in Florida by saying we're not going to have a presidential primary. And this is the kind of stuff that happens in Tehran, not in Tallahassee. I've never seen something so absurd, so disenfranchising, and so suppressive of Democratic voters.
The online left is constantly talking about how we need to be more like other industrialized countries, and how the only way in which America is exceptional compared to the nations of, say, Western Europe, is in how awful we are. Well, America really is exceptional in that most other industrialized democracies don't have a democratized process for choosing candidates. As a link Mark writes in Primary Politics, in a nutshell, the fact is that roughly 50 years ago, American political parties gave up their responsibility for nominating candidates and turned it over to whatever subset of the population chose to vote in a party primary. No other political process in the modern world has so abandoned this critical vetting function of the political party in the nomination process. In other democracies, the nomination of the national leader is held within the institution of the political party. The abdication of political responsibility by existing leaders, like Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, in their best-selling book, How Democracies Die, often marks a nation's first step towards authoritarianism. J.J. McCullough has an entire video breaking down how some other industrialized democracies nominate their candidates. And go figure, it's usually not through primaries or caucuses. The link to the entire video is in the description box below. So yeah, having an undemocratic process for nominating candidates doesn't exactly turn you into Iran. As I've also established here, this is how we used to do things. Remember FDR, the greatest president we've ever had, according to the online left? He wasn't nominated democratically. He was chosen at the 1932 Democratic Convention. He did win some primary contests prior to it, but the majority of delegates back then were not allotted through contests like they are now. So he had to win them over at the actual convention, which he did. In the 1950s, the golden age of America that everyone pines for, where there was a car in every garage and a chicken in every pot, where everyone went to work at factories and we could all support a family on that wage, Pretty much all elected officials were nominated at conventions from their parties, not through primaries or caucuses. Ironically enough, it was the 1970s, when the US embraced the evils of neoliberalism.
Neoliberal bootlickers.
And things started to turn for the worse when our major political parties started to democratize the nominating processes. Now, if you watch this channel, you know that I don't think this is an accurate description of the trajectory of our country's well-being, but it's more or less how a lot of people, including people who want democratized primaries, see it. By their own logic, things were much better off when we didn't have meaningful primaries. Maybe we should go back to that. And understand, I am not saying that we used to do things this way, therefore we should do it that way now. I'm saying that, unless you think 1950s America is akin to the Islamic Republic of Iran, you'll have to concede that undemocratic nomination processes are perfectly compatible with a well-functioning democracy overall.